So, welcome everyone. My name is Lavana Leyendecker, and I am the Associate Director of the PA Budget and Policy Center and Keystone Research Center. I'm really happy that you can join us today. We're very excited for this panel to speak about housing and the importance of having safe, affordable, and adequate housing here in Pennsylvania. And I just want to go over a couple of technical details before we get started, and then I'll jump right in and introduce our speakers. So if you're just joining us, again, my name's Lavana Leyendecker, and I'm the Associate Director with the PA Budget and Policy Center and the Keystone Research Center. And to get started, for those of you who are joining us through the Whova app, if you have a question during the presentation, we're going to hold all questions to the end, but in the app, you should see a space for Q&A, and you can go ahead and enter your question in the Q&A, and we will respond to questions at the end of the presentation. So I will look at those and pull as many as we can, and we'll ask our speakers directly to respond to them. And if possible, I may ask if you can unmute yourself and ask your question yourself. But if you're not able to do that or not able to come on video, that's fine. We're happy to also read your question for you. If you're having trouble accessing the app, or you can't hear, you're struggling in any kind of way, you should put your concerns in the comments. And we have someone there who's specifically watching the comments to help you with your questions or concerns. So please use the comments for any technical issues that you're having. I mean, you're also welcome to chat with each other, but that's what we're monitoring, those comments for your concern. All right, so it's 1:02. We're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm sorry, I'm just getting a little response here. So, all right, great. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. So for those of you who are just joining and who didn't hear the beginning, I'll say my name one more time. My name is Lavana Leyendecker. I am the Associate Director for the PA Budget Policy Center and the Keystone Research Center. And I'd like to begin our presentation today with Andrea Menino. Andrea is the Senior Advisor for Policy and Practice for the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. And the Housing Alliance is a statewide coalition working to provide leadership and a common voice for policies, practices, and resources to ensure that all Pennsylvanians, especially those with low incomes, have access to safe, decent, and affordable housing. And with that, Andrea, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can share your presentation.
Great, thank you, Lavana. And I am super excited to be here with the PA Budget and Policy Center and Stephanie Senna and Senator Saval. Just really looking forward to hearing what they have to say on this topic as well, things that I can learn about and learn from. So thank you for being here with us today. So as Lavana said, my name is Andrea Menino. I'm Senior Advisor, Policy and Practice at the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. So for those who don't know about the Housing Alliance, we're Pennsylvania's statewide advocacy organization for safe, decent, and affordable housing, ending homelessness, and revitalizing our communities by remediating blighted properties. So I'm going to discuss Pennsylvania's affordable housing challenge in and I want to frame it in three different ways. So first, I'm going to go what challenges existed before the pandemic, what additional challenges has the pandemic and its economic impacts created, and what can we do moving forward. I'm also going to share some resources where you can learn some more about the need for affordable housing and solutions in Pennsylvania. And when this is sent out afterwards, there are links in the presentation for you as well. So I want to preface my presentation. The information I am sharing is not positive. It's not good news. The affordable housing challenges we face are big, and due to past and current laws, policies, and practices, Black and Brown people are impacted the most. While these challenges are heartbreaking and seem very large and complicated, there are two things I want to point out. One, we need to know what our challenges are so we know how to solve them. And two, and most importantly, there are solutions to our affordable housing challenges that we have. I'll touch a bit on what the Housing Alliance is doing, but I'm very excited to hear Stephanie and Senator Saval talk about what they're doing to solve our affordable housing challenges in Pennsylvania. So pre-pandemic, many individuals and families faced economic hardships. The Federal Reserve noted that many individuals didn't have $400 to cover an emergency. And to put it into context, an expense many people have, AAA did its own study and found that a third of drivers can't cover a $500 to $600 car repair bill without incurring debt. So many families are one car repair, one appliance breaking, one inconsistent paycheck away from meeting their housing expenses. So here is data from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. In Pennsylvania, we have over 5 million households and roughly 9% or over 443,000 households have extremely low incomes. So what does extremely low income mean? Extremely low income households in Pennsylvania have incomes at or below 30% of the area median income. In Pennsylvania, this equates to less than $25,000 for a family of four. So think about that, trying to raise a family of four on less than $25,000 a year. And for all of these people who live in poverty, what are their housing options? In Pennsylvania, we have a shortage of housing that people can afford. So based on this National Low Income Housing Coalition data, they have estimated that we have 38 affordable and available rental homes per 100 extremely low income renter households. And they also provide that data at the county level if you want to see more what the conditions are in your communities. For those who can get housing, more than 80% of extremely low income renters spend at least 30% of their income on rent. So that's that first blue bar in the chart there. And 70% of those extremely low income renters are severely cost burdened, meaning they spend up to half of their income on rent. And we see in this chart that even as incomes go up, many households are still cost burdened, meaning that they struggle to pay, as they struggle to pay their rent, they also don't have the funds necessary to pay for other costs such as healthcare, food, transportation, or education. And we know that the pandemic is making these numbers worse. So I want to break down housing challenges in a couple of different ways. And this is not to pit different groups of people against each other, but to better understand the challenges facing the most vulnerable. So the first is by renters and owners. So I'm going to explain the different income categories that I have shown here on these charts. So as I just mentioned, extremely low income households have incomes at or below 30% of the area median income, or $25,000 for a family of four. Very low income households make between 30% and 50% of the area median income, and 50% is a little over $41,000 for a family of four. Low income households have incomes between 50 and 80% of the area median income, where 80% of the area median income is approximately $66,000 for a family of four. So in Pennsylvania, 28% of all renter households have extremely low incomes as compared to 7% of all owner occupied households. So that's that dark blue or first pie wedge there. In total, 68% of renter households have low income, very income, or extremely low income. So that's the sum of the three blue shaded pie wedges. And then you compare that 68% to 33% of owner occupied households. So this is the second way I want to break down who is affected by poverty and housing challenges in Pennsylvania. So I have a very simple chart here. Each bar is a different race or ethnicity, and the line is the state's poverty rate. While many communities don't think of themselves as diverse in Pennsylvania, in practically all communities, this chart holds true. We did an analysis for another project and found in 25 different communities across the state, the Black poverty rate was always higher than the white poverty rate, and that in nearly all communities, the Latinx poverty rate was higher than the white poverty rate. So there are a few things that should jump out at you from this chart. So first, all demographics except the white population have higher poverty rates than the state's poverty rate. Second, most races and ethnicities have poverty rates 2.5 times to 3 times that of the white population. And then third, 1 out of 4 people in the Black and Latinx and our Native communities live in poverty. It is critical to disaggregate this type of data. Without disaggregating data, we know that the state poverty rate is 12%. So take that number for what it is, whatever it means to you. When we disaggregate that data, we see glaring disparities across race and ethnicity that reflect what the effects of our racist laws and policies which are embedded in our government, our institutions, and our business practices have created. And in, still in our housing world and our real estate world of what these have created. We must understand these and see them so that we know what changes we need to make and who we need to bring to the table to help make those changes. So now I'm going to switch to what the impacts of COVID-19 has added to the already challenging situations facing our low and moderate income families and especially our families of color in Pennsylvania. So first, let's take a look at the job loss. So early on in the pandemic, most businesses shut down. We had the businesses were actually closed and then they slowly started to ramp back up, but we're still not even at full business operation, full economic operation across the state yet, because we're still dealing with the virus. This chart, so what I have here is a chart that shows shows industries by the average wages of each of those industries. So early on in the pandemic, the largest number of jobs lost were in sectors of the economy with the lowest wages. So this chart in particular shows for the employment, for the leisure and hospitality industries, which are still not fully, back up and running. So what we're seeing is they were one of the most affected and still most affected industries that sustained large job loss. And you can also see, though, in those 2 blue bars, they are the industry with some of the lowest paying jobs in our economy. So those who have lost their jobs or have lost wage and income, lost hours, are those who are making the least amount of money in our economy and now facing new housing stability challenges that they have not had to face before. So we're having new parts of our population dealing with housing and income challenges. So now let's take a look at job loss by disaggregating the data. As I just mentioned, we need to disaggregate the data. So over the summer, nearly half of Pennsylvania households experienced job income loss. I mean, that's a devastating number in its own right? Like half of Pennsylvanians had job income loss. Then we disaggregate that by race. We see that more than 60% of Black households had experienced income loss and that nearly 80% of Latinx households experienced income loss. I want you to pause on that for a second. If you thought nearly half of the population suffering income loss is bad, how about for the Latinx population where nearly 80%, and I personally classify that as practically all of Latinx households in Pennsylvania experienced income loss due to COVID-19. So next, I want to disaggregate by housing tenure, meaning whether someone owns or rents their house, and by race. And so this is that same midsummer data. We're at the height of job loss. Maybe we're having a little bit of businesses opening back up. We can see that even across owners and renters, there's big disparity across races in terms of the ability to meet their housing payments. So what we can see here is Black households at 44% had trouble meeting their mortgage payments compared to 4% of white households. So they were 11 times more likely to have trouble meeting their mortgage payments. And then we can see by those who rent that Hispanic and Black and even Asian households had more trouble meeting their rental payments than white households. So we can see once we disaggregate that data, we can see the individual impacts across the different races. So next, I want to flip the script that I've been following now. So if tenants are unable to pay their rent, landlords, many of whom are individuals operating on tight margins, are unable to meet their own financial and operational obligations. Individual investors own more than 3/4 of single family and small rental unit buildings. These individual investors who own 1 to a few units of rental housing also typically include our naturally occurring affordable housing, meaning that's market rate housing at lower price points that low and moderate income families can afford. So if a landlord can't pay their mortgage, their taxes, their home insurance, or make repairs because tenants have lost their incomes due to COVID, it means landlords may need to sell those properties. They might not be able to upkeep them, or they might fall into foreclosure themselves. All negative effects that affect both the landlords and their tenants. So we're concerned about the loss of safe, decent, and affordable renting housing due to the economic impacts of COVID. And it's not just affecting renters, it's affecting landlords too, hence the importance of all the rental assistance coming up, so we can maintain these homes, keep them safe and decent, and keep them affordable, and make sure people stay stably housed, especially when we're dealing with COVID-19. So here's just a quick glance of where we are right now. Vaccinations are underway. We're on a downward trend of everything that's going on. Pennsylvania is easing business restrictions at the beginning of next month. However, the virus is still present. So while for economic reasons and health reasons, we're starting to open back up, we still have the presence of the virus where we need to make sure that we're making smart health choices. So there are legislative responses in action, and hopefully looking forward to hear Senator Saval talk about some of his legislative responses to some of these. So right now, some of these solutions are meant to deal with COVID, and some of them are actually longer term. So right now we have rental and utility assistance programs actively running in communities across the state. And with all the federal stimulus funding that we have coming in from the last, we had federal stimulus funds coming in the end of December, and then the American Rescue Plan just passed. We need to also figure out how we can use this funding equitably to help our communities, that helps build them up, helps them now in their time of need, and helps build them up for a sustainable future. We had a big win in the low income housing tax credit world with what's called a permanent floor on our 4% tax credits. So that's the tax credits are the way that are the funding sources that builds the most affordable housing in the country. So one of them is now set up to build approximately 130,000 more affordable homes over the next 10 years. So that's great. And then the state legislature created the state housing tax credit last year. So very excited. It's a policy priority of the Housing Alliance. However, it was passed without funding. So we will be working this year. Our priority is to get that funded. So while stats and reality are challenging and depressing, as I said, there are solutions, and we just saw some of those. These are not going to be overnight fixes, but we can continue working on them and are improving our responses to these challenges. We want to be in a world where people are stably housed in safe homes they can afford. So, and what are these opportunities for 2021 looking like? So I think, this past year has helped many who did not already recognize, see the challenges faced by people of color in our communities, which means we have more support, more resources to dedicate to equitable community development that is meant to uplift all and not just some in our communities. And we also know that we must listen to the residents of our communities because they know what they need to be sustainable and have, live the fulfilling lives and have safe, decent, and affordable housing. Due to staying at home and close to home, we have a heightened awareness of the importance of our built environment, our homes, our green spaces, the flow of our buildings. So that's all really important for housing as infrastructure and green space around them. And there's also a greater recognition that housing is a social determinant of health. And this has brought forth new initiatives to bridge the gaps between housing, health, and community organizations. So as I mentioned, when the slides are shared, I have linked some resources here for you to learn more about all of these issues and what you can do to help. I also just want to talk about the Housing Alliance has created these county fact sheets for every county in Pennsylvania. And we share some of, as I discussed here, some of the affordable housing challenges we have, but also some of the solutions that are being implemented in each of the counties. So you can get some county level information here for your communities and use these as an advocacy and educational tool. So Thank you very much. And I am going to turn it back over to Lavana.
Thanks, Andrea. That was really great. I appreciate it. And I forgot to mention at the beginning that Andrea is really kind of focusing on the problems and, the depth of the housing crisis in Pennsylvania. And I think gave a really excellent overview of that. So with that, I want to turn it over to Senator Saval, who many of you know from the first senatorial district. He has had a amazing career as a labor organizer and a writer, and is a really dedicated activist. And along with other progressive legislators, has been working really hard to think creatively about how we can even expand our vision of what we could do on the policy level to alleviate the major shortage of affordable housing that we have here in Pennsylvania. And I just want to note quickly before I turn it over that I see that some of you have questions already. So we're looking at those. And when all of our speakers are done, we're going to come back and address those questions. So with that, Senator Saval, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lavana, and thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Andrea, for that great presentation. It's great to be up here with you and with Professor Senna. Nikhil Saval, I'm here to speak about housing and housing policy in some ways, some things that we are working on. I'm the chair of the Democratic chair, excuse me, of the Urban Affairs and Housing Committee in the Senate. And so we'll talk a little bit about ways that I think we can frame the issue, what we are working on now, with other housing advocates and allies in the Senate, and things that we can think about long term. So just to start with a bit of framing, I think probably a lot of us here would agree with the idea that housing is and should be considered a human right. But when we think about the state budget and how resources are prioritized, we tend not to treat it that way. We tend not to make the long-term investments necessary to ensure that every Pennsylvanian has safe housing that they can afford. And in the ways that Andrea deduced in her presentation, this predates the pandemic, but it of course has been hugely magnified and laid bare for many people under the current conditions. And as a result, the link between health and housing is just clearer than ever. People experiencing homelessness are in more danger than when we were told to stay home to stay safe. Families living in substandard housing can get comorbidities that put them more at risk if they get COVID. People with disabilities and seniors with low incomes have been trapped in deadly nursing homes, even though many could and want to live independently, but can't find accessible housing they can afford. And so housing needs to be a central component for legislators like myself to plan for recovery and beyond for a state where people can thrive. And so far in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, we've been able to delay an avalanche of evictions with various federal and statewide moratoria. However, at the end of this month, the CDC's eviction moratorium, which itself is flawed, is slated to end, and there are too many families across the Commonwealth who are terrified of what happens next. Fortunately, this month brings, as Andrea raised, a new round of emergency rental assistance. But as we saw in the first rounds, the state getting funds from the federal government and the people who need those funds getting them from the state are two different things. And how we effective we are at getting the people the assistance they need will determine the breadth of the eviction crisis. And so my role today is to run to what we are working on this session to respond to the crisis and what policies we are building on long term. So I will start a little bit with rental assistance. So one thing we have already done is to ensure that the state rental assistance program maximizes the distribution of federal funds. As you all know, both the CARES Act and the Recovery Act allocated hundreds of millions of dollars to Pennsylvania for rental and mortgage assistance. However, the funding comes with a catch. You have to spend 65% of that amount by a certain date, originally September 30th, 2021. That date may change based on the American the ARP, but it was the original date. Last year, Pennsylvania did not spend its allocated rental assistance money in the first round because there were certain counties that either did not have the capacity or perceived need for assistance and failed to spend their allotments. So what we fought for in essentially our first 2 weeks in session was a redistribution date, where money would be transferred from counties not on track to spend their allotment to counties on pace to exceed or meet theirs. I just want to repeat that because it's a little bit wonky. So we wanted a redistribution date where money would be transferred from counties that were not on track to spend their allotment, not on track to spend the CARES Act money distributed to them, to counties that would be on pace to exceed or meet theirs. The original redistribution date contained in the legislation, September 1st, was too late. Many rentalists, so again, I'll just be clear. So you had to spend 65% of your funds by September 30th. The original legislation that was proposed by the governor and the four caucuses was September 1st, was too late, because many rental assistance programs take over a month for applicants to navigate. So there wouldn't have been enough time for the money to be redistributed between counties and then sent to tenants and landlords. We flagged this for both the House and Senate Appropriations Committees and offered a floor amendment on the initial final passage vote in the Senate. That amendment failed on party lines, but it brought attention to the problem. And then the House Appropriations Committee worked in a bipartisan fashion to move the redistribution date back based on our proposal. The Senate then unanimously supported it, with my colleague and co-chair of Urban Affairs, Senator Joe Pittman, thanking us for our attention to the details of this bill and my doing the same. So this redistribution date might sound like a wonky technical change, but it will actually lead in practice to tens of millions of dollars staying in Pennsylvania to be used for rental assistance. That's the difference, frankly, between thousands of families staying in their homes or being evicted. And so I'm incredibly proud to be part of the call for that change in my first month in session. And beyond enacting that initial legislation, we will continue to do everything we can to push the Department of Human Services to do aggressive outreach and remove barriers to accessing support. At the budget hearings that we held recently, I asked the secretary to consider working, for example, with courts to tell people about rental assistance before eviction filings proceed. And my office will also do our own sort of outreach to ensure that our constituents know these funds are available and how to access them. So that in particular is the rental assistance piece. I mentioned eviction moratoria. We are still in the midst of a pandemic, and thousands of Pennsylvania families are at risk of eviction come April 1st. We've introduced legislation with Senator Vincent Hughes to extend the eviction moratorium until 60 days after the COVID emergency declaration ends. A majority of our caucus, the Democratic caucus, has co-sponsored this legislation. It is necessary so that folks can access rental assistance from the federal government and get back to work, as many service sector parts of the economy, which Andrea pointed out, were deeply badly hit, especially in sort of hospitality industries, as those parts of the economy open back up. Relatedly, and in a way as part of legislation to that eviction moratorium legislation, we have introduced housing security legislation with Senators Katie Muth and Steve Sanicero that would help homeowners, landlords, and renters at the same time. There have rightfully, I believe, been calls for the cancellation of rent and mortgage payments during the pandemic. We are facing an unprecedented amount of debt, and we need unprecedented solutions. Unfortunately, those solutions, many of the solutions that have been offered for, say, canceling rent or canceling mortgage payments, while very laudable, have often not been constitutional under federal or Pennsylvania constitutions as proposed. And so we found a way to actually make this technically feasible under the Constitution and, according to all our housing regulations. So our bill, the Housing Security Act, would require state-regulated mortgage servicers to grant deferrals to all qualifying property owners, homeowners, and landlords alike. The program is designed to ensure that deferred loan payments are not structured as a balloon payment, because a participating borrower's mortgage terms would be extended for the same number of months that the property owner participates in the deferment program. Any late fees, processing fees, or service fees would be waived. At the same time, tenants living in properties receiving this deferral would have their rents reduced proportionally to the mortgage amount being deferred. This would have the effect, technically, of canceling rent and mortgage payments for the duration of the pandemic, while keeping property owners and servicers whole in the long run. And I'm proud to have designed this legislation from the ground up with Senators Muth and Sanicero, and we believe it should be implemented as soon as possible. Of course, we understand the realities of a Republican-led legislature, but this is a a piece of legislation that that we really believe in. And there's there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to work on housing legislation more generally. And there's one piece that we believe has been and will attract more bipartisan support, and that is legislation for sealing evictions. Now, eviction records are an enormous barrier to housing for tens of thousands of families in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. As many of you know, a tenant is saddled with an eviction record the second a case is filed against them, regardless of the eventual result of the case. In short, you can have never been evicted from your home, and you can still have an eviction record. I just want to make that clear. You can have a case processed against you. You still get a record that you've had an eviction processed against you. And like many injustices in our state, this phenomenon disproportionately affects Black and brown families. This is because tenant screening agencies simply use computer programs to, quote, scrape data from court dockets when they are hired to run a screen of a tenant by a landlord. But those reports just show whether a case was filed. They fail to differentiate between cases that end in an eviction and those do not. So I'm working on legislation in the Senate with a host of representatives and senators from both parties that would automatically seal all eviction cases the moment they are filed. Case dockets would still be available to view for parties in the action, but otherwise the public cannot access those dockets. An eviction case would only be unsealed 30 days after a judgment for possession or money is entered against a tenant. This way, when a tenant screening company does a check on a tenant, they only find eviction records for tenants who actually lost an eviction court. And this is not a small problem. The eviction lab at Princeton University estimates that of the 80,000 eviction cases filed each year in Pennsylvania, only 30,000 result in a judgment. Yet all the folks who have faced eviction suits, they have a record, not just those that were evicted. And so we are working with our colleagues in the House and in the Senate on both sides of the aisle to ensure that that injustice is rectified. That is this legislation that we are working on now that we believe would have immediate effects and help the broader recovery process. That said, we have long-term goals, and for all the reasons that that Andrea mentioned, that we have a long-term housing crisis that well predates the pandemic, that well predates some of the issues that we're discussing. So one major issue is that we need dedicated funding for housing in our state budget. We don't really have a dedicated line item. There is just no way that we do housing in a serious way. I'm not holding budget hearings with the Department of Housing. None of these things happen. It's not an issue that really captures the interest or is really dedicated support within the state budget process. Moreover, the way that housing tends to be funded in these situations it tends to rely primarily on tax credits. And so we want to move away from those kinds of tax credits and towards a tax and essentially towards direct investments for housing. In other words, we need fewer tax credits and more just grants in order to create direct investment in housing. Moreover, one thing that we've learned, I believe, from the rental assistance programs in particular, but lots of WIP programs, is that we should be exploring direct cash assistance to tenants. This is versus a traditional Section 8 assistance. In other words, it's the difference between an invisible subsidy and a visible subsidy. Many people may know that Section 8 discrimination is rampant, even though it is technically illegal. It happens all over the place. And so it makes it harder for people actually to use their vouchers. But moreover, if there's just a way that we can actually just give cash to people and just give them direct assistance, it will work better as a program than the programs that we tend to have. Finally, I would just, our largest main long goal is to create a Green New Deal for housing. And in particular, to think about our housing crisis and our climate crisis as being twinned. And we know that climate and housing are connected. We know that, for example, the history of redlining and redlining maps corresponds directly to heat islands in our cities, and the like. And Black and brown families overwhelmingly bear heating costs that they cannot afford. So we need massive retrofits, and in addition to creating these broader, deep investments in affordable housing, attacking both our energy efficiency and energy costs, as well as our affordability crisis. Now, we know that we don't have the political power right now to pass these long-term policy ideas, even if, honestly, even if Democrats held the majority in our state. These are not widespread issues across our caucus. So our first hurdle is to make housing a human right as a priority for the Democratic caucus in Pennsylvania. And so to start, we are developing infrastructure that coordinates a kind of inside-outside strategy with the housing justice movement leaders across the state. We have formed a roundtable, a Housing as a Human Right roundtable, which meets with advocates, including the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. And we plan to build a constituency for the change that we want to see in order to move the needle on housing and housing policy. So we plan to hone our agenda and then to organize around it to change the political weather in Pennsylvania, in our Democratic caucus, and just across the board to pass these long-term visions around housing. So that's the goal, that's the plan, and that's what we're working on now, and that's what we hope to work on in the future. And I'm excited to work with people on this call and with Andrea and with Stephanie for the things that we want to see. So my contact information is here. That is our direct Harrisburg office line, as well as our Senate email address. So please get in touch if you want to work with us on these issues, and also if you have any questions. So thank you so much, and excited to hear from Professor Sena.
Thank you so much. That was really great, and I'm really excited about all the proposals that the Democrats in the Senate are moving forward. So with that, I want to introduce Professor Stephanie Sena, who is the Anti-Poverty Fellow at Villanova University. And Stephanie is also the founder and executive director of the student-run Emergency Housing Unit of Philadelphia, a nonprofit homeless shelter that's been operating since 2011, where students provide shelter, food, and community to individuals experiencing homelessness. And Stephanie's been really innovative with her group and in her work to really see people as whole human beings, to be pet friendly, to make sure that they're living full and healthy lives. And so Stephanie's going to address some of the solutions that have come from people who have experienced homelessness and how they've been working within their own communities to house themselves and to create a housing for all. So Stephanie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lavana, and thank you for including me in this panel. I'm grateful to be collaborating with Senator Saval and Andrea Menino, and Senator Saval knows I am the president of his fan club, and grateful for his advocacy in the Senate. So I want to start by saying that what I tell my students at Villanova in the law school is that poverty is a robbery. And in order to understand poverty, we need not to look at people who are suffering from it, but those who are benefiting from it, those who are profiting from systems of poverty. So I want us to keep that in mind as I go through these slides, especially because I'm going to talk a little bit more about the housing crisis and solutions, but in light of really income inequity and the gap in wealth is the largest it's ever been since the census started tracking that as a metric over 50 years ago. And it is growing larger in Pennsylvania yearly. So that's a major problem. So one of the issues when we talk about housing, we need to talk about wages. And we know that in Pennsylvania, wages have been $7.25 as a minimum wage since 2007. So in 2021, though, in Philadelphia, the average one-bedroom apartment cost as a rental cost $1,400 a month. So one bedroom in Philadelphia is going for an average of $1,400 a month in 2021, and that was throughout the year 2020. So in PA, in the state of PA, the average market rental is $1,180 per month. Now, if you are making the minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, for you to be able to afford rent, and that is, it's to be able to be not housing insecure, but have housing that is affordable, you are spending no more than 30% of your total household income on housing expenses. In order for people to do that, with the cost of housing, the cost of rentals at between $1,400 and $1,800 a month, you would have to make $28 an hour. Not $7.25 an hour, but $28 an hour. So we have a minimum wage that is widely disparate from the cost of housing and the cost of living in Pennsylvania. Now, Governor Wolf proposes that we increase our minimum wage to $15 an hour by the year 2027. To start a minimum wage increase of $12 an hour starting on July 1st of this year, 2021, and then raising by 50 cents more every single year until 2027 when we get to $15 an hour. And I think that's bold. I think we need to think even bolder because again, $15 an hour is still not commensurate with the cost of housing and the cost of living in Pennsylvania, and certainly not in Philadelphia where I live. In Philadelphia in 2020, median sale price of a house rose by $30,000. And in 2020, the price of housing increased by over 12%, 12.8%. In West Philadelphia alone, the average home price went in year 2020 from $85,000, it jumped to $120,000. So housing is becoming more and more a luxury item as opposed to a right. And more people are becoming unhoused. We're seeing that constantly as we also see the growth of homeless encampments throughout the region. These increases are dramatic in Philadelphia, but they are also dramatic across the entire state of Pennsylvania. In Bucks County in 2020, prices increased by 11.9%. In Chester County, 8.6%, and in Delaware County, 13%. So prices are on the rise throughout the entire state of Pennsylvania. But I want us to make an absolute distinction between home ownership and home rental. The average home owner in the United States has a net worth of almost $200,000. And in Philadelphia, the average homeowner is paying a mortgage of about $893 a month. That's the average mortgage for a homeowner in Philadelphia. But a homeowner's net worth, which is around $200,000, that is 36 times more the average net worth of a renter. A renter's net worth is about $5,400 net worth. And in a rental, an average rental property is average $1,400 a month. What that means is that people who are below the poverty line in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, and throughout the country are actually spending significantly more on rent, and they have significantly less home net worth. And this is creating cycles of poverty and keeping not only income inequality at a massive gap, but our racial inequality at a massive gap, because home ownership is largely based on race. We have redlining that still exists, not de jure, but de facto, meaning that even though the law says that we don't have redlining, what's happening is that banks are refusing to give mortgages to people of color who are looking to own. So most home ownership is actually condensed into the hands of people who are white. And so this is further creating a racial divide in our country. 46% of all housing units in Philadelphia are rental. So almost half of all the housing in Philadelphia is rental. I want us to also, we've been talking a little bit about tax subsidies, and Nikhil, Senator Sabal was incredibly correct and right on when he said that most of our assistance to in terms of people who are in need of housing is in tax credits as opposed to direct cash. And that's right, and it's a problem. In addition to that, when we look at tax subsidies, the vast majority of our federal and state tax subsidies are actually going to home owners as opposed to home renters, even though those who are the poorest are renting as opposed to owning. So to put that into numbers, federally, we are spending about $134 billion on subsidies to homeowners. We're basically giving homeowners money. And federally, we spend about $20 billion on rental subsidies like Section 8 vouchers. So that's a massive difference between what we're spending on homeowners versus what we're spending on renters. And so when we think of welfare in our country, we usually think of welfare for the poor. But it is my belief that we're actually giving significantly more welfare to those who already have resources such as home ownership. They already have net worth. They already have wealth. That's where our welfare and our tax money is going. In terms of the PA budget for 2021, expenditures in Pennsylvania make up about 4.25. Great. We have an increase in population and an increase in costs that needs to also see an increase in spending, an increase in expenditures. And we're going to talk about where that money needs to go. But Pennsylvania is considered one of the terrible 10 in the country, one of the 10 worst states when it comes to regressive tax rates. What that means is the bottom 20% of our population in Pennsylvania, that's people making under $24,000 a year, they pay an income tax rate that is more than double the tax rate of the 1% in Pennsylvania, who are averaging $1.7 million a year. That's in Pennsylvania. So Governor Wolf has proposed in 2021 to lower the tax burden for the poorest 60% and raise it for the highest 40%. That's important, and we need to be advocating for that and pushing that even more, that people who are experiencing homelessness, people who are low income, people who are living in poverty should not be paying so much higher of a tax rate than people who are the poorest, so the richest rather. We need a progressive tax rate rather than what we have in Pennsylvania, a regressive tax rate. And Senator Sabal also mentioned evictions, which is a problem. In the United States, there's 4 evictions per minute. In Philadelphia, that's 20,000 per year. Philadelphia is the 4th highest city for evictions in the country. And what we need is actually more legal aid. We need more lawyers to help tenants. When landlords take tenants to court, landlords have attorneys with them about 80% of the time. Tenants have attorneys with them about 11% of the time, and that's because tenants usually cannot afford attorneys. With an attorney, if a tenant has an attorney in eviction court, they are likely to win that case 95% of the time. So the chance of a tenant winning the case and not being evicted goes up by 95% if they have an attorney with them. So in Pennsylvania, City Council member Helen Gim passed, I think about 2 years ago, something called the right to counsel, which is the idea that tenants should have a right to attorneys with them in court. That was passed in the city of Philadelphia. However, it wasn't fully funded. So in order to be fully funded, that needs to have $3.5 million per year in that fund. If we fund the right to counsel by $3.5 million a year, allowing tenants to have attorneys with them, this is a cost savings of about $45.2 million a year. A cost savings from things like homeless shelters, which is where people who are evicted have to go when they become homeless, and other public benefits. But it's a massive cost savings to provide legal aid for people. I had a conversation with Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon recently, and she gave me a statistic that blew me away. She said that in the United States, we spend more money every year on Halloween costumes for our pets than we do on legal aid for people who are low income and experiencing poverty. And that is a tragedy, and we need to reverse that. Today's homeowners are mostly banks and hedge funds, private equity funds like Blackstone, which is the world's largest landlord. In Philadelphia, the largest landlord is actually the Philadelphia Housing Authority. Most of these entities are actually having the houses sit vacant, waiting for land to appreciate in value so they can sell it for a profit. And then the cost of housing and the cost of land is increasing. This creates further gentrification and displaces mostly people of color. In the United States, there's approximately 17 million vacant houses. In Philadelphia, about 12% of our housing stock is vacant. That's 80,000, over 80,000 homes in Philadelphia. In PA, about 11,000% of our stock is vacant. So in the entire state of Pennsylvania, we have almost 600,000 houses vacant. In relation to that, the last point in time count estimates that Pennsylvania has about 13,500 people experiencing homelessness on any given night. 650 of them are children. So what I'm saying here is there are significantly more vacant houses in this state and in this country than there are people who need housing. This is not about a lack of resources. It's about the unequal distribution and allocation of those resources. Also, we have a housing stock in Pennsylvania that's very old. About 20%, 27% of all homes in the United States are older than 1939 and in dire need of rehabilitation. I'm so glad that Andrea Menino and the Housing Coalition of Pennsylvania are working on remediation for these houses, because we desperately need remediation for these houses that are so old and falling apart that they're often condemned and torn down. A massive problem. Since 2012, when the RAD amendment was passed by Congress, allowing public housing units, public housing authorities throughout the country to sell off their housing stock to private developers, that's been happening all over. So last year, the Philadelphia Housing Authority sold 144 vacant lots to developers, announced sales to sell 2 towers with hundreds and hundreds of renters to sell them to private developers who are going to then fix up the units and sell them at a market value or at a high rate that people who are low income can't afford. We're also having public housing demolished. So between 1990 and 2008, 7,800 public housing units were demolished in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia now, about 600 to 1,000 houses are public housing are vacant. Some of those vacant public housing units I broke into this summer with other advocates and placed in mothers and children who are homeless into those public housing vacant units. There's about 40,000 people on the wait list in PHA, and that list has been closed since 2003. Again, when I want to be clear, when I say poverty is a robbery, that this is about the allocation of resources. So the Philadelphia Housing Authority, and this is not just Philadelphia, these housing authorities operate like this throughout Pennsylvania and throughout the country. Philadelphia's Housing Authority has a budget of $47 million a year, but they have a 30-member private police force that's incredibly expensive. The CEO, Jeremiah Kelvin, makes $350,000, and they just built a $45 million headquarters that I took a picture of that's on the right of the screen. And what we need is more money and more investment going into this image here that I have on this screen you're seeing is our vacant houses in Philadelphia that are public authority housing. So we need a reallocation of resources away from expensive headquarters and police forces to housing so that we can house people who need it. In terms of the advocacy work, this is last slide, second to last slide. The Pennsylvania budget needs to invest in housing. As Senator Saval said, we need it as an item in the budget. Budgets are values. What our values are, our budget states that. The fact that we have no area for housing in a Pennsylvania budget states that we do not value housing for our neighbors. And that's a massive problem in Pennsylvania and throughout the United States. So our budget needs to start investing money in housing and also legal aid, which I mentioned is incredibly important. Senator Saval talked about eviction ceiling, which is incredibly important work that he's doing in the Senate. There are people in Philadelphia working on this with the leadership of Rashida Phillips from the Community Legal Services. I'm in that group along with Erin Blair, who's in the audience right now. And so we need advocates to do work on eviction ceiling to make sure that tenants who have been evicted are not kept from renting again when landlords can see their eviction records, especially those whose eviction ended up not being in their favor, but as Senator Saval mentioned, they still have a record of eviction, keeping them from renting again. We need to change, as I mentioned, from a regressive tax rate to a progressive tax rate when the richest are paying the highest rate of income tax. We need to increase the minimum wage, not just randomly, but relative to the cost of living. And as Senator Saval said, we need direct cash assistance to people in need. That's incredibly important. Right now, we get SNAP benefits, so benefits for food to people, and if people sell their SNAP benefits for cash, which they need, that is a crime. And people in our prisons are currently sitting there for having sold their SNAP benefits for cash. This is ridiculous. And we need to start providing renters direct cash, people who are low income direct cash. We also need in the state of Pennsylvania to work on zoning policy change and building policy change. Advocates are also working on that with Senator Saval. That's important. Our zoning and building code are very exclusionary and prevent people from being able to live affordably in Pennsylvania. I think our zoning policy and building code should be emulated off of Minneapolis's, which had a lot of zoning and building code changes recently, but that's an important advocacy work that needs to happen in order to drive down cost of housing. And I think we need to look at other ways of living, including investing in what's called community land trusts and limited equity co-ops, in which the people of our state have a direct investment in their housing and in the land, where they will be able to build wealth. But lastly, I want to say that what we really need to concentrate on is housing as a human right. Housing is a right for all. And as Senator Saval said, I keep quoting him, but this is work that is inside outside, rather outside inside. What we need is people who are advocates, people who have direct experience with poverty, lived experience with homeless, leading this fight. And we all have a place in this advocacy work, whether it is legislative work, direct action, protesting, or working with Senator Saval. We are all desperately needed in this work because what we have right now is untenable and unsustainable. And I know I've been talking very long, but I'm just going to leave with this amazing quote that I love and I want us all to reflect on by Farah Jasmine Griffin. She says, "Movements are long in the making. Activists, organizers, artists, and thinkers invest time, do the work, preparing, imagining new possibilities, and identifying the way. Finally, an ember ignited by a myriad of factors takes flame and becomes incandescent. We are in a moment of incandescence, a rendering of light, illuminating all that is vile and murderous, but also clearing ground for those who have prepared, those who have planned, and those who stand ready to make the world anew." And I'm grateful to have to be in this work with other advocates who are on this call, including Senator Saval and Andrea Menino, but also all of the participants and the audience members who are also advocates. We need to envision something much more equitable for ourselves and our neighbors. So that's it, and I'm happy to share my slides with anyone and happy to do this work with all of you because it's desperately needed. Thank you so much, Lavana, for giving me the opportunity to share that today.
No, thank you, Stephanie. This has been really great. And thank you for talking about the great work that you've been doing. And, you know, we talk a lot about at the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, how we have an upside down tax system and we have an upside down income system in Pennsylvania. And this, I think in housing, it really comes to bear more than almost any other area, you know, compared to like workforce development and other things. So thank you. So with that, we've got a good amount of questions. So I want to try to get to those. And I want to thank Senator Saval for joining us. I know he has to jump off at 2 o'clock. So I don't know if you want to say goodbye really quickly and then we'll.
And I'm so sorry to have to leave, but we just have to jump to a budget hearing. But on education, which has, of course, connects to housing. But I want to thank Stephanie, and you, Lavana, and Andrea for all your wonderful presentations and the opportunity to be here. Emma from our staff is able to stay on and can absolutely capably and brilliantly represent our office. So and help take questions as necessary. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna turn it over to questions. I'll just go in order that people ask them. So I have a question from Amanda Waldman. Amanda, if you're with us and would like to unmute yourself, I'm gonna send you a little request. I'll give you a minute. If not, if you're not able to, that's fine. I will ask your question. It says, I'm a member of the board of my local Center for Independent Living. Do you have information regarding the housing crisis and people with disabilities and policies that are specifically geared towards the disabled community? So I'll put that out to the group if anyone has any specific information or resources to point for Amanda.
Amanda, I'll just say broadly, connecting health and housing has been one of our policy priorities in the last couple of years, and specifically within the disability community, of finding homes that are accessible. So as Stephanie clearly stated, you know, more than a quarter of our homes were built pre-1939. And if you think about it, they all have stairs, the bathrooms on the second floor, all the bedrooms are probably on the second floor. So trying to figure out how we can make our homes accessible. I am blanking on where to point you for resources right now, but I will think of it and we can add them to resources that Lavana sends after the presentation.
Thank you. And Andrea, that actually prompts me to remind everyone that if you missed any part of this presentation or you would like the PowerPoints, they will all be available on the Whova app after this is over. And I have actually been collecting all the questions and I'm going to make notes of the answers and I will add those to the information that goes with this as well so that we can have that. And especially if we don't get to answer all the questions, I'll try to get answers for everyone. So we have another question from Janice Gladden, and I'm just going to go ahead and ask Janice this question because we have a couple and I want to get through them all, and I think we can. So in the interest of time, Janice, I'm just going to point out, and I think everyone spoke to this a little bit, so I'll just throw it out to the group, but she says, the New Deal and the Fair Housing Act, or prior to the Fair Housing Act, sanctioned housing segregation and inequality and discrimination and set the stage for housing and wealth disparity due to race that continues to this day. Can and will anything be done to right this wrong? So everyone kind of addressed that, but if you could talk specifically about some of those policies and some things that are being done currently to address it, or maybe not being done to address it. Stephanie, do you want to jump in on this a little bit?
Lavana, can you repeat the question for me?
Sure. So basically, she's pointing out that the New Deal and the housing policies of the 1930s essentially created a mortgage system that created redlining, yes, which persists today. And right, what are we doing about it? Because that problem is not gone away.
No, I think we need to, first of all, hold banks accountable. There's a lot of research, wonderful research that's happening right now in terms of the denial of Black people of home loans. And I think that the information is there. I think we need to make sure that banks are reporting on who is getting a mortgage, sharing these reports, and then also sharing how they are, what they are doing to increase home ownership. For the Black community in particular, who has been left out of the housing market for forever and continues to be today. There's a great podcast that I recommend. Reveal podcast has done incredible work on redlining today and housing inequity and disparities. And I encourage anyone to look up that podcast. I would just Google like Reveal and redlining housing disparities. And I'll put the link in the chat actually. But I think that what it comes down to is we need to be asking these questions about why are people not getting loans. We need to rethink how we're looking at credit scores because that's often what is keeping people, it's an automated system where people's credit is held against them. But also if it's predominantly Black people who have been renting, as I mentioned in my slide, they have a much smaller net worth. So people who are white, who are going in to own a house for the first time, they are often coming with wealth that has been passed down from generation to generation. And that wealth they're able to put down on a down payment. So we have these systems in place that make it so much easier for white people to get home ownership than Black people. But we also have banks that are just refusing people. We know that it is race-based. So think we need to hold it accountable and think about how we encourage home ownership, but more importantly, look at housing as a right as opposed to a commodity. But it's a major problem. I appreciate the question. It's keeping our cities and our states segregated and depriving people of housing and a right to life, really. So I think that we are all needed to reverse this trend.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. So Lisa asks, as someone working in coordinated entry, qualifying for the previous rental assistance program was complicated and difficult with significant barriers to utilization. She speaks with many individuals who spend months trying to apply only to get rebuffed due to arbitrary qualifications requirements. And so will this be addressed in future programs? Andrea, can you speak to that a little bit about what happened with the first CARES relief bill and what might be corrected for the current one?
Yes, and I think Senator Saval touched on this also. Yes, so the prior CARES rental relief program that ran at the second half of 2020 was put together stood up very quickly, and so kudos to standing it up quickly, but then also stood up with so many protections and requirements in place that the money could not get out the door. So they could not get the money to those who needed it because there were so many requirements, and one of those requirements was that the landlord had to participate. And some of those participation requirements, though, were forgiveness of parts of the earlier part of the program was you can only get $750 to cover your rent. The landlord had to forgive the remaining monthly rent. So to Stephanie's example, if rent is $1,400, they were asking landlords to give up roughly half a month's of rent for the program. So a lot of landlords said no. So the new program is rolling out across counties as we speak. Some of the counties have their programs stood up. A couple of counties, their programs are not stood up yet. The new program was built with less restrictions, less landlord involvement. There is a way for tenants to get direct assistance if a landlord does not participate in this program. It also requires, you're supposed to provide as much documentation as you can, but there is a trigger point where a self-attestation where saying, I am low income, I have lost income, I've worked an hourly job, my former employer won't give me the paperwork because it's a former employer, so they don't care about me anymore. So there is a mechanism in there to sign a self-attestation instead of requiring, a ream of paperwork, which was essentially required last time. So the new program was built with those considerations in mind. So the hope is that money will get to those who need it. There is a requirement for when they have to spend money by. So, the counties as of right now have to spend 65% of all the funds that flow. So there's roughly $850 million funded to the state right now, to the state as a whole for this rental assistance program. They're supposed to spend 65% of that by, I think it's June 31st, although those months might change. So they're pushing for this money to get out quickly, and the way to do that is to have less restrictions. So hopefully, we're going to monitor this really closely. From what we heard, we talked to the counties who are doing this program, to several of the counties just yesterday, and applications are pouring in already. So I would just say, get your application in. All the counties are also looking to work with you. They saw the problems too. The administrators were so frustrated they could not get the money out the door last time. They want to work with you. A lot of them have set up easier systems to help make this an easier process. So I would say, apply again, and let's hope, all the considerations that have been taken into place help get that money out the door. Lavana, you're on mute.
Sorry. Marlene asked a follow-up question asking, how do we find out which counties did not distribute their funds and where those funds are redistributed? So is there just a resource to find out which county agencies were responsible for the housing?
For the CARES Fund, most of the counties, it was many of the RDAs, and then some counties farmed it, had another organization work with it. PHFA, or the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, was responsible for running the program last year. They have a report out, although I don't believe it is detailed as to that level. I would contact them. The money was able to be redistributed into the state budget and ended up, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it went to our prison system in the state budget last time. Okay. So the money went to that in the state budget, and that's it. So we're just working off of this new pot of money right now.
All right. Thanks, Andrea. Emily asked, this might be our last question, but Emily asked that for Senator Saval mentioned that giving cash to people for housing would be more effective than vouchers. And how might that tie into or expand to TANF, which is a highly problematic cash assistance program for low-income families, or something like general assistance, which was just ended by the GOP last year or 2 years ago. And could a guaranteed basic income address housing goals? So Emma, do you want to speak a little bit to some of those policy ideas? Also,
yeah,
for basic income.
I think thank you for the question. I think so it's very much at the idea stage right now, so I should start with that. But my understanding is it wouldn't be tied into any existing programs, because the whole idea is to eliminate barriers, right, and make it get people the support they need as easily as possible. So any existing programs that have unnecessary barriers wouldn't be the right fit. And the idea is, if we're just recognizing that people don't have the resources that they need to have safe, accessible housing that they can afford, a basic income, like you're saying, would get to that goal, as well as raising the minimum wage to a living wage would also help towards these goals. They're all, it's all part of the same problem.
I just want to add that when our welfare system changed in 1996, which I think, even though it was messed up in 1996 and prior, it was a much better system than what we have since 1996. The current welfare system we have in TANF assumes full employment on living wage. And what we have is minimum wage and an awful job market. So what we've seen since TANF was put in place is that the amount of people who are living on $2 a day or less in our country has dramatically increased. And even food banks are seeing a huge strain because so many people are in need. And so the restrictions, as Emma's talking about, the barriers to accessing help are in many ways insurmountable. And I think when it comes to a UBI, universal basic income, this was an idea that at one point, I think in our country was fringe. Advocates were talking about it and have been talking about it for a long time. But I think that right now this idea is becoming more mainstream, especially with Andrew Yang bringing it up in his presidential platform when he was running for office. And I think it's already being tried out in places like Stockton, California. And Stockton, California is seeing major benefits in that people who are getting direct cash assistance are using it to get a leg up, to really help them afford the things that they need, such as housing and food and medical care. So I'm a huge advocate. I think it's been tested in many places throughout the United States, but also throughout the country. And we have the statistics and we know that this is something that works. And so I'm just hopeful, because I think that we have an opportunity in this crisis to rethink how we're doing things, and ideas that one time seemed so radical are now, we're talking about them as not radical, but inevitable, that these policy changes will be made. But we need more people to advocate for them. We need this conversation to be central. But I'm a huge advocate of UBI, which is basically cash assistance. And we've seen, like I said, if you look up Stockton, California's UBI, it's working in other places. So I think it's something that we should be considering in Pennsylvania.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I think that's probably all the time that we have for questions. I can't thank my panelists enough. I thought this was extremely informative, very passionate because this is such an important issue. And it's something that the Budget and Policy Center is really looking at diving deeper into, because I think from our perspective, where we look at the budget as a moral document, the fact that housing is not really a line item, it's more like something that's funded if we make enough money off of something else, just demonstrates that we're not putting our priorities in the right place. And I also think that thinking of housing as infrastructure is a place that we really want to explore more. And we hope that all of you will stay more engaged as we dive deeper into this policy area. So with that, I just want to note again that if you missed any part of this presentation, don't worry, you can watch the recording later. We will make all the PowerPoints available. I'm going to put the questions and answers with those documents as well. And I want to note that next Thursday, our workshop sessions will be towards racial equity in Pennsylvania public policy. And that will be with two state legislators, Representatives Donna Bullock and Representative Napoleon Nelson. And we're going to be talking about supporting campaigns for immigrants' rights in Pennsylvania, including a report that we recently put out on why giving driver's licenses to people who are undocumented can really help to improve their lives and also improve our overall economy. So thanks again. This has been really great. And with that, I'll say goodbye. Everyone have a great rest of your week and have a great weekend. Thank you.